Constellation aligned. Engage thrusters. Thrusters engaged. Vector lock. Asteroid field ahead. Initiate evasive pattern.
The Cardassian patrol vessel Grumall was running a standard border sweep along the edge of the demilitarized zone when the universe cracked open. There was no warning. No sensor ghost, no gravitational anomaly, no subspace distortion that Gul Evik's tactical officer could have flagged in time. One moment, the stars held their ancient positions, cold, indifferent, eternal. The next, reality itself split apart like a wound torn by something that did not belong in this dimension. And through that wound came fire. The rift was enormous, jagged at its edges, rimmed with a sickly bruise of purple and green energy that no Federation scientist would have recognized as warp energy, because nothing in the Alpha Quadrant had ever generated it. It yawned open like the mouth of something alive, and through it fell two vessels, one clearly diseased, its hull weeping bioluminescent corruption, architrailing tendrils of mutated metal that writhed as though in pain, and one that was magnificent. The Fang of Morkai was a Space Wolves strike cruiser, and it hit Federation space like a thrown axe. It was not built for elegance. It was built for war. Its prow was shaped into the snarling head of a great wolf, rendered in ancient ceramite and adamantium, scarred by 10,000 years of void combat. Its flanks bore the marks of campaigns that predated the Federation by millennia. Impact craters sealed with crude welds, trophy icons bolted to the hull. The pelts of alien creatures stretched across sensor arrays as declarations of dominance. It was a vessel that had crossed the Eye of Terror, hunted chaos fleets through the warp's howling darkness, and emerged victorious through the sheer, unrelenting ferocity of the warriors it carried. It emerged from the rift already firing, lance batteries discharged in sequences that the Grumall's shields were never designed to absorb. The Cardassian vessel, a competent ship by Alpha Quadrant standards, armed and crewed by experienced soldiers, lasted 11 seconds. The first salvo stripped its shields entirely. The second collapsed its structural integrity field. The third delivered with the clinical efficiency of warriors who had been fighting this particular kind of corrupted enemy for centuries, unsplit the Grumall along its primary hull and sent its crew into the void in a cascade of escaping atmosphere and dying light. Gul Evek managed one distress transmission before his ship ceased to exist. Aboard the Fang of Morkai, Wolf Lord Alaric Stormfang stood on the bridge of his strike cruiser and watched the wreckage drift across his viewport with eyes the color of glacier ice, pale, cold, and absolutely focused. He was enormous. Every Space Marine was enormous. But Alaric had led the Stormfang Brotherhood for 40 years of active campaigning and wore that experience across his body like a second skin of scar tissue. His power armor, Mark VII, Aquila pattern, painted in the blue-gray of Fenris, adorned with wolf skulls and chapter iconography, hummed with a microfusion reactor that could shrug off weapons impacts that would destroy ground vehicles. His frost axe, World Cleaver, hung at his hip. His bolt pistol was already holstered. The enemy in that vessel had not required his personal attention. "Brother Gunner," he said, his voice a deep, measured growl that carried the accent of a world that did not exist in this universe. "What is this place?" The Space Wolf at the navigation station, younger, his facial tattoos still sharp and unblurred by age, his ears bearing the enhanced auditory canals of a fully implanted Astartes, studied his instruments with growing confusion. "My lord, I cannot determine our position. The star charts do not match, not even partially." He paused, and when a Space Wolf paused in confusion, it meant something. "We are not in the segmentum obscurus. We may not be in the galaxy we know." A lesser warrior might have shown fear. Alaric showed nothing except the slight tightening of his jaw that those who served with him had learned to recognize as deep calculation. The corrupted vessel, damaged but intact, attempting to flee on a heading I cannot correlate. Or its warp signature is still active. It could tear another rift. "Then we hunt," Alaric turned to his communications officer. "What struck us? The vessel we destroyed?" "Unknown configuration, my lord. Not chaos. Not Xenos of any cataloged species. Their weapons were..." The communications officer hesitated. "Weak. Energy-based. No physical projectiles. Their hull construction suggests they were not a warship. The Wolf Lord was quiet for 3 full seconds. Around him, even the bridge crew of space wolves, 20 Astartes, each a continent of engineered muscle and ceramite, each capable of tearing through a bulkhead with their bare hands, waited for his assessment. The Fang of Morkai groaned around them as its systems recalibrated from the warp transit, plasma conduits repressurizing, void shields cycling back to full extension. "We destroyed a vessel that was not a warship," Alaric said finally. It was not a question. It was the sound of a man recalculating everything. "Yes, my lord." "Were there survivors?" Another pause. "Unknown. Sensors are struggling to calibrate to local space. The physics here are subtly different. Brother Apothecary Fenwick reports that our instruments are reading background radiation at wavelengths we have no baseline for." Alaric walked to the viewport and placed one gauntleted hand against the transparent steel. Outside, the debris of the Cardassian vessel was still expanding slowly outward, catching the light of an unfamiliar star. He had destroyed many ships. He had never destroyed one by accident. The distinction mattered to him in a way that it might not have mattered to a warrior of lesser principle. The Space Wolves of Fenris had their own code, older than the Codex Astartes, rooted in the saga traditions of their homeworld. You did not kill without purpose. You did not waste lives without necessity. He had just done exactly that. "Find the corrupted vessel," he said quietly, "and prepare to receive contact. Whatever civilization built that ship will come looking for it. When they do, I will speak to them." He paused. "After I understand where we are." In the vacuum outside, the wreckage of the Grumall told its silent story to the stars, and 3 light-years away, a subspace distress signal was already reaching the USS Enterprise D at the speed of light, carrying Gul Evik's final, frantic words. Something came through. Something impossible. It destroyed us in seconds. Do not engage. Do not. Then static. Then nothing. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. The Enterprise D dropped out of warp at the edge of the debris field with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a crew that had faced the impossible before and learned to treat it as Tuesday. Captain Jean-Luc Picard stood at the center of his bridge with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the view screen with the expression he reserved for situations that defied immediate categorization. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a controlled stillness around the jaw, now the posture of a man who was already 3 moves ahead of the problem, but had not yet decided which move to make first. Around him, the bridge of the Enterprise hummed with the quiet urgency of a vessel on yellow alert. Consoles bathed in the warm amber light that meant something is wrong, but we are professionals and we are handling it. "Report," he said. Lieutenant Commander Data turned from the operations console with the fluid precision of an android who processed information at a speed no organic mind could match. "We are detecting the remains of a Cardassian Galore-class patrol vessel, Captain. Configuration consistent with the Grumall. Registry confirmed through partial hull fragment analysis. Crew complement was approximately 230. He paused for exactly the duration a human might pause to acknowledge the weight of that number. "There are no life signs." Counselor Troy spoke before Picard could. "There's something else out there." Her voice carried that particular quality it took on when she was reaching for an emotional signal that didn't fit any template she'd encountered before. "I'm sensing..." It's difficult to describe. Extreme focus, controlled aggression, or something very old and very certain of itself. Multiple presences, all similar in emotional signature. She frowned. "Whatever they are, they don't feel lost or frightened. They feel like hunters who have just realized they're in an unfamiliar forest." "Worf." Picard's eyes moved to the tactical station. The Klingon straightened incrementally, which on Worf meant he had gone from combat-ready to actively eager. "1 vessel, Captain. Configuration unknown. No match in Federation databases, Klingon databases, or Cardassian shared intelligence files. Hull material is partially readable. It contains metals and alloys I cannot identify. Its weapons signature?" He stopped. The pause from Worf was more alarming than any alarm. Captain, whatever destroyed the Grumall was not a phaser, a disruptor, or any directed energy weapon in our records. The impact pattern suggests kinetic accelerated mass projectiles combined with a directed energy lance system of extraordinary power output. The Grumall's shields were at full capacity when it was destroyed. It took 11 seconds. The bridge went very quiet. Picard absorbed this. A Galar-class vessel at full shields, destroyed in 11 seconds by weapons that weren't in any database. He turned to the helm. Mr. Crusher, hold position, full stop. He looked back at Worf. Shields? Already raised, Captain. Hailing frequencies, Lieutenant Worf. Frequencies open. All standard Federation diplomatic channels. A plus broadband transmission. Picard straightened, composing himself into the version of Jean-Luc Picard that had made first contact with species across the quadrant. Measured, authoritative, genuinely curious despite the circumstances. This is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise, representing the United Federation of Planets. We are responding to a distress call from this location. We have no hostile intentions. We request communication. The response that came back was not what any of them expected. It came through the universal translator in fragments at first. The translator working visibly harder than it normally did. Its algorithms struggling with a linguistic structure that bore no relationship to any language in its database, not even as a distant phonetic cousin. Then, gradually, like a signal resolving through interference, it found purchase. And a voice filled the bridge that made several crew members straighten involuntarily without understanding why. It was deep. It was unhurried. It carried within it the absolute, granite-settled confidence of something that had never in its life needed to project authority because authority was simply a fact of its existence, like gravity or time. Federation Vessel. I am Lord Alaric Stormfang of the Space Wolves, 6th Legion Astartes, servant of the God Emperor of mankind. I acknowledge your communication. I also acknowledge that we destroyed a vessel in this location without confirmation of its hostile intent. This troubles me. Identify the nature of that vessel and its allegiance. I will hear your answer before determining our next course of action. Data tilted his head precisely 7.3 degrees. Fascinating. The linguistic structure suggests a derivation from Old Terran Gothic with significant phonetic drift consistent with approximately 8 to 12,000 years of linguistic isolation. The speaker appears to be human, Captain, or descended from humans. Picard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Human. The genetic markers in the bioscan we are currently running, passively through their hull emissions, suggest human-based genome with extensive modification. Extraordinary modification. Data's golden eyes moved across his console with increasing speed. Captain, if these readings are accurate, the individuals aboard that vessel possess a musculoskeletal density approximately 4 times that of baseline human. Multiple redundant organ systems. Neurological processing speed significantly elevated above human norm. They are... He paused again. And Data's pauses meant something different from Worf's. They meant the android had encountered data that required genuine processing time. They are human beings who have been engineered into something considerably beyond human. Troy leaned forward slightly. Their emotional signature is clarifying now that they're communicating. The one who spoke, the Wolf Lord. There's grief underneath all that focus. Recent grief. He knows he destroyed something he shouldn't have. Picard made his decision in the space of a single breath. He pressed his comm badge. Picard to Transporter Room 3. Stand by. He straightened his uniform with the small, precise tug that his crew recognized as him stepping into history. He opened the channel. Lord Stormfang. The vessel you destroyed was a Cardassian patrol ship, a member civilization of the Cardassian Union, with whom the Federation has a complex but non-hostile relationship. Its crew were soldiers, but they were not your enemy. I would like very much to speak with you directly. Not through sensors and subspace channels, but face-to-face. I extend this invitation in good faith, and I give you my word as captain that you will be received with respect. A beat. I suspect you are as far from home as it is possible to be. So am I, in a sense, every time I leave space dock. Yet the difference is that I chose this. Something tells me you did not. The channel was silent for a long moment. When Alaric's voice returned, it carried something new at its edges. Not warmth, exactly, but the specific quality of a warrior recognizing that he was being spoken to honestly by someone who was not pretending the situation was anything other than what it was. Send your coordinates for transport, Captain Picard. I will come. 3 of my brothers will accompany me. Or attempt nothing hostile, and you will find us reasonable. Worf's hand moved toward his console. Picard stopped him with a look. Stand down, Mr. Worf. Captain, we do not know what we are letting aboard this ship. No, Picard agreed quietly. We don't, but we know what we are. And part of what we are is willing to find out. He turned back to the view screen, where the Fang of Morkai hung in the starfield like a monument to a kind of war this universe had never imagined. Transporter Room 3, 4 to beam aboard. Cargo Bay 1, give them room. Cargo Bay 1 was the largest open space on the Enterprise D that wasn't a holodeck, and Chief O'Brien had quietly suggested it over Transporter Room 3 for reasons that became immediately, viscerally obvious the moment the transport sequence completed. The transporter effect, that familiar cascade of golden light, the harmonic shimmer of matter energy conversion that every Starfleet officer had experienced hundreds of times and stopped truly seeing, behaved differently with these 4. The energy columns were wider, substantially wider. The pattern buffers, O'Brien would report later with the slightly dazed expression of a man recounting a near miss, had registered mass readings that caused 3 separate diagnostic alerts before the computer recalibrated and accepted that yes, this was apparently what these beings actually weighed. They materialized, and the cargo bay, a space designed to hold industrial equipment and shuttle components, suddenly felt small. An Alaric Stormfang stood at their center, and he was wrong in the way that a cathedral is wrong inside a house. He was not simply tall. Tallness was a relative quality, a matter of centimeters and perspective. Alaric was scaled differently, as though the universe that produced him had been operating under different assumptions about what a human body was for. He stood 2 meters and 60 centimeters in his armor. And his armor was not padding or exaggeration. It was a powered exoskeleton of ancient manufacture that moved with him like a second skin, each servo-assisted joint responding to muscle impulse with mechanical fidelity. The whole system exhaling faint heat shimmer at its exhaust ports. The wolf skull mounted on his right pauldron was the skull of an actual Fenrisian wolf, large enough that a baseline human could have worn it as a helmet. His 3 companions were similar, not identical. One bore a staff topped with runic ironwork and wore the gray robes of a rune priest beneath his armor, his eyes carrying the particular quality of someone who sees things that aren't entirely in the visible spectrum. One was younger, his armor less decorated, his posture carrying the barely contained kinetic energy of a warrior who had not yet learned to be still. The third was massive even by Space Wolf standards, a Bloodclaw veteran whose chains word, a meter of adamantium teeth rotating at several thousand RPM, currently inactive, was holstered across his back with the casualness of someone carrying an umbrella. Picard had positioned himself at the center of the cargo bay with Data, Troy, and Worf. He had deliberately not brought security personnel with weapons visible. He had thought carefully about what this first physical meeting needed to communicate, and he had decided it needed to communicate respect for the warriors he was receiving, not fear of them, even though his entire security team was monitoring from 3 concealed positions, and Worf had argued, with considerable passion, for at least a full tactical team. The 4 Space Wolves took in the cargo bay, the Enterprise, and the 4 Starfleet officers in the space of approximately 2 seconds. Their eyes moved with the systematic efficiency of beings who had been assessing threat environments since before they could form complete sentences. Alaric's glacier-pale gaze settled on Picard, and something shifted in his expression. A microscopic recalibration, the adjustment of a warrior who had been prepared for soldiers and found instead something he didn't have an immediate category for. Picard stepped forward. Wolf Lord Stormfang. I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard. Welcome aboard the Enterprise. He kept his hands visible, his posture open. I regret that the circumstances of our meeting are what they are. Alaric looked at him for a long moment with those pale eyes. Then he looked at Worf, Really looked, with the focused assessment of one warrior cataloging another. And something shifted again, this time toward interest. He looked at data and went very still in a way that suggested the android's nature had registered immediately and was being filed under a category that required more information. He looked at Troy last, and his expression did something complicated that his face was not entirely designed to show. "You brought an empath," he said. His voice in person was everything it had been over the channel and more. It resonated in the chest cavity, a physical phenomenon as much as an auditory one. "We deliberate." "Yes," Picard said simply, "to read us. To help us understand each other. There is a difference." The Wolf Lord was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, with the particular movement of a very large thing choosing to be deliberate about how it occupies space, he reached up and removed his helmet. The face beneath was human in the way that a storm is weather. Technically accurate, practically overwhelming. He was perhaps 50 years in apparent age, and though Data would later calculate he was considerably older. His features were broad and angular, weathered by decades of campaigning across environments that made deep space look hospitable. His hair was iron gray, worn long, pulled back with a leather cord. His eyes were the same pale blue-gray as his armor, and across his left cheek ran a tattoo in the knotwork style of Fenris, marking his pack, his deeds, his name in the saga language of his homeworld. He studied Picard with those eyes for a moment longer. Then he said, "The vessel we destroyed. You said it was a patrol ship, a military vessel. Armed, yes, but on a routine border survey, not engaged in combat operations. Their weapons were charged when we emerged from the rift." Picard considered this. That would be standard protocol upon detecting an unknown contact, not an act of aggression. "In my universe," Alaric said slowly, "an unknown contact is an enemy until demonstrated otherwise. The demonstration takes time. In void combat, there is rarely time." He paused. "I am telling you this not as justification. I am telling you this so you understand what we are, what we were made to be." His jaw tightened fractionally. 230. Troy made a slight sound that wasn't quite a word. She had not expected that. The weight he was carrying for those 230 lives, sitting in this enormous, unarmored ancient warrior like a stone in still water. "You know the number," Picard said quietly. "I always know the number." Alaric's eyes moved to the viewport at the far end of the cargo bay, where the stars of an unfamiliar sky were visible. "Captain Picard, we came through a warp rift while pursuing a vessel corrupted by chaos, by a force of metaphysical corruption that your science will struggle to quantify, but that I assure you is real and is dangerous. That vessel came through the rift with us. It is in this system. It is wounded, but a wounded chaos-touched vessel is not less dangerous. It is more dangerous." He looked back. "I need to know if your people understand what that means." "Explain it to us," Picard said. "We will listen." The rune priest at Alaric's shoulder, Brother Valdris as the Wolf Lord would name him, spoke for the first time. His voice was quieter than Alaric's and carried a different quality, something that made the universal translator work slightly harder, as though his words existed on more than one frequency simultaneously. "The corrupted vessel carries a signal, a beacon. If it activates fully, it will tear a permanent rift, not a transit point, but an open wound in the fabric of reality. Things will come through that wound that your weapons cannot stop." Data said, "Can you quantify the nature of these entities?" Valdris looked at Data with eyes that were seeing something Data's sensors could not detect. "No," he said, "but I can tell you that in 10,000 years of fighting them, we have not found their limit." The cargo bay was very quiet. Picard clasped his hands behind his back. "Then," he said, with the careful precision of a man choosing his next words as though they were steps across uncertain ground, "it would appear we have a shared problem. And in my experience, shared problems have a way of creating unlikely partnerships." He met Alaric's pale gaze steadily. "I am not asking you to trust us yet. I am asking you to work with us. There is a difference there too." Alaric looked at him for a long moment. The chainsword on the Bloodclaw's back caught the cargo bay lighting and threw a brief reflection across the ceiling. "Yes," the Wolf Lord said finally. "There is." The corrupted vessel had not been idle. While Alaric Stormfang stood in the cargo bay of the Enterprise D and negotiated the careful provisional architecture of an unlikely alliance, the ship that had followed the Fang of Morkai through the warp rift was doing what chaos-touched things always did when given time and opportunity. It was spreading. Not through space, not yet, through subspace. And the signal it was broadcasting was not a communication in any sense that Starfleet's linguistic algorithms could parse. It existed below the threshold of standard sensor resolution, woven into the background radiation of local space like a thread of rot through living wood, present, purposeful, and almost invisible unless you knew precisely what you were looking for. Brother Valdris had known. He had felt it the moment he materialized in the cargo bay. A pressure at the edges of his runic wards that made the psychic architecture he maintained around himself flicker like a candle in a draft. He had said nothing yet. He was still deciding how much this crew could be told without breaking them. The first indication that something was wrong came from Deep Space Nine. Picard received the communication 40 minutes after the Space Wolves' arrival aboard the Enterprise. Each while he was in the observation lounge conducting the most unusual strategic briefing of his career. Alaric sat at the conference table, the chair groaning quietly but holding, which O'Brien would later call a minor miracle of Cardassian construction, with Valdris standing at his shoulder, and the younger space wolf, Brother Fenric, positioned near the door with the patient stillness of a guard dog that has been told to be polite. The Bloodclaw, Sven Ironteeth, had been diplomatically requested to remain in the cargo bay with a security officer named Lieutenant Chen, who was doing an admirable job of not visibly panicking. The communication from DS9 came through Commander Sisko's voice, and even through the subspace relay, it carried an urgency that Picard's crew recognized immediately. Enterprise, this is Commander Sisko on Deep Space Nine. We have a situation developing on the station that I need to flag immediately. On 17 crew members have reported to the infirmary in the last 30 minutes with symptoms that Dr. Bashir cannot explain. Auditory hallucinations, elevated aggression, disrupted sleep patterns in personnel who haven't been asleep, and in 2 cases, what Bashir is describing as compulsive behavior directed toward the station's weapons locker. We also have sensor readings of a subspace signal emanating from somewhere in the system that doesn't match any known Federation, Cardassian, or Bajoran technology. I'd appreciate any information you have, Captain, because I have a feeling you know something I don't. Picard looked at Alaric across the conference table. The Wolf Lord's expression had already changed before Sisko finished speaking. He had heard what Picard heard, and he had translated it instantly into a framework his 10,000 years of institutional memory recognized with cold, absolute certainty. "The beacon is activating," he said. Faster than I expected." "These symptoms you're describing," Picard said to the open channel, "are consistent with what you've heard from your allies." Alaric leaned forward slightly, and the table registered the shift in distributed weight. "Commander Sisko, the signal affecting your crew is not a weapon in any conventional sense. It is a psychic emanation, a resonance that targets minds with existing stress fractures, amplifying instability and aggression. Your most psychologically vulnerable crew members will be affected first, but given time, it reaches everyone." He paused. "You need to identify which of your crew are showing the earliest symptoms and remove them from proximity to the signal's apparent source. They are not responsible for what they are experiencing, but they will become dangerous." There was a silence on the channel that contained approximately 4 different kinds of discomfort. "I'm sorry," Sisko said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man filing several very large questions for later. "Who exactly is that?" "Commander Sisko," Picard said. "I will explain everything shortly. In the meantime, I need you to implement his recommendation. The source of the subspace signal is a vessel currently hiding in the asteroid field near the system's 4th planet. Do not approach it. Do not attempt to communicate with it." "Understood." Sisko out. The channel closed. Picard looked at his senior staff around the table, then back at Alaric. "You said faster than expected. What does that mean for our timeline?" Valdris answered before Alaric could. A full activation of the beacon will take 6 to 8 of your hours at current propagation rate. When it activates, it will attempt to tear a permanent rift approximately 3 kilometers in diameter at the coordinates of the corrupted vessel. He paused in a way that suggested what followed was the part he had been deciding whether to say. The entities that will come through that rift are what your people might classify as extra-dimensional. They are drawn to psychic resonance, to suffering, to the kind of concentrated emotion that your space station currently represents. A place of trauma, of occupation and liberation, of spiritual significance. His eyes, already carrying that quality of seeing beyond the visible spectrum, grew distant. For them, Deep Space Nine would be extraordinary. A feast. The observation lounge was very quiet. Data, who had been processing everything with the focused intensity of an android encountering a paradigm shift, said, "Brother Valdris, are you describing entities that feed on emotional or psychic energy?" "Among other things." "And the crew members currently experiencing symptoms on DS9. The signal is conditioning them, preparing the environment." Valdris looked at Data with an expression that contained something unexpected. Respect. "Yes, exactly that." Picard stood. Decision crystallized in him with the clean finality of a man who had been building toward a choice and had arrived. "We have 6 hours. And I need to move the Enterprise to intercept the corrupted vessel before that beacon fully activates. I also need to coordinate with Commander Sisko to secure DS9. He looked at Alaric. "And I need to know everything you know about destroying a chaos-corrupted vessel. Everything." Alaric rose from his chair in a single, fluid motion that belied his size. The movement of a warrior who had spent decades learning to move in powered armor as naturally as a man moves in his own skin. He reached to his belt and produced something that he set on the conference table with a sound like a geological event, a tome, bound in material that the Enterprise's sensors would spend the next several hours arguing about, covered in script that the universal translator would make only partial sense of. Its pages dense with 10,000 years of accumulated tactical doctrine for fighting exactly this kind of enemy. "This," he said, "is the Codex Maleficarium. A partial copy of what my chapter has learned about chaos corruption across 10 millennia." He met Picard's eyes. "Your science will not explain most of it. I am asking you to accept it anyway." Picard looked at the tome. He looked at Alaric. He thought briefly of every first contact protocol, every scientific framework, every Federation principle that governed how Starfleet processed the impossible. Then he picked up the tome. "Mr. Data," he said, "I'd like you to begin analysis immediately. You work with Brother Valdris." He looked at Troy. "Counselor, I need you on DS9 within the hour. Your empathic abilities may help identify which crew members are most at risk." He looked at Worf, who had been silent for the last several minutes with the expression of someone reassessing everything they thought they understood about the nature of threat. "Mr. Worf, work with Lord Stormfang on tactical options for engaging the corrupted vessel. Find common ground." Worf looked at Alaric. Alaric looked at Worf. For one moment, something passed between them. Warrior to warrior, across the vast cultural gulf of their respective universes. That was less diplomatic protocol and more the simple, direct recognition of two beings who had spent their entire lives at war and could see that quality reflected back at them from across a conference table. "Come," Worf said simply. Alaric followed him without another word, inducting his pauldrons through the doorway that had not been built with him in mind, and Fenric fell into step behind them both with the quiet, professional readiness of a space marine who understood that the mission had just changed shape but had not changed nature. Picard stood alone for a moment in the observation lounge, the Codex Maleficarium in his hands, its cover warm against his palms in a way that the ship's environmental systems could not entirely account for, staring out at a star field that contained, somewhere in its depths, something that 10,000 years of superhuman warriors had never managed to fully defeat. He thought of something Alaric had said in the cargo bay. "In my universe, an unknown contact is an enemy until demonstrated otherwise." He set the tome down carefully, straightened his uniform, and went to work. The Klingon bird of prey, Hoveler, Starblade in the old tongue, decloaked off the Enterprise's portbow with the aggressive theatricality that Klingon captains considered both tactically sound and personally satisfying. Captain Korath, son of Mora, had been monitoring subspace frequencies along the Cardassian border when the distress signal from the Grumall reached him. He had not come out of diplomatic obligation. The Federation and the Klingon Empire maintained their alliance with the careful, slightly suspicious courtesy of two powers who respected each other more than they entirely trusted each other, and a destroyed Cardassian vessel was not automatically Klingon business. Korath had come because the Grumall's final transmission had described something that destroyed a shielded warship in 11 seconds, and in Korath's personal philosophy, anything capable of that deserved to be looked at directly and assessed for its worthiness as either an enemy or an ally. He had not expected what his sensors showed him when he arrived. Captain. His tactical officer's voice carried the specific quality of a Klingon warrior encountering data that conflicts with his established understanding of the universe. The vessel accompanying the Enterprise, the large one with the wolf iconography on its prow, its crew complement reads as human. But the biosigns are— Say it, Korath said. Wrong. Magnificently wrong, sir. Korath studied the Fang of Morkai on his view screen with the focused appreciation of a predator assessing another predator. The strike cruiser was visibly ancient in a way that Klingon vessels, themselves built with deliberate attention to tradition, were not. It had the weathered, scar-covered presence of something that had survived by being fundamentally, persistently harder to kill than everything it had ever encountered. The wolf-head prow looked back at him from across 300 kilometers of vacuum with an expression that Korath found, despite himself, genuinely impressive. He opened a channel to the Enterprise. Picard, I am reading an unknown vessel of considerable armament in your company and 17 Cardassian crew members who are no longer alive to explain themselves. I would appreciate an explanation before I decide how to feel about this. Picard's response was measured, as it always was. Korath had dealt with the Enterprise captain enough times to recognize that Picard's calm was not passivity but strategy. Captain Korath, your timing is, as always, dramatic. I'll explain what I can. The vessel you're reading is called the Fang of Morkai. Its crew are human, or were human, unoriginally, warriors from another dimension who arrived here through a warp rift. They destroyed the Grumall in error, believing it to be a hostile contact. The situation is considerably more complex than that summary suggests, and I need your help. Korath leaned back in his command chair. Another dimension. Human warriors who could destroy a Galar-class vessel in 11 seconds. He looked at his first officer, who returned his gaze with the expression of someone who had accepted that serving under Korath meant periodically encountering the genuinely extraordinary. I am coming aboard, Korath said. It was not a request. He materialized in Transporter Room 3 with two of his senior officers and the immediate physical confidence of a Klingon captain in his prime. Broad-shouldered, armor-plated in the traditional style, his Doktog at his hip and his honor sash bearing the marks of 7 major engagements. He was a formidable man by any reasonable standard. He walked into the corridor leading to the bridge and came face-to-face with Alaric Stormfang. The Wolf Lord had been returning from the tactical situation room with Worf, moving through the Enterprise's corridors with the careful deliberateness of something large navigating spaces built for smaller beings. He rounded a corner and stopped, and Korath stopped, and for 3 full seconds neither of them moved. Korath was not a small man. Standing before Alaric, he was nevertheless reminded of the experience of standing before a particularly old and large predator. Not threatened, exactly, but made suddenly and completely aware of scale. Alaric looked down at him with those pale glacier eyes and performed the same rapid assessment he gave everything he encountered. Threat level, weapon disposition, emotional state, intent. What he found made him tilt his head fractionally. You are not Federation, Alaric said. It was an observation, not an accusation. I am Klingon, Korath said, with the particular weight a Klingon places on that word when speaking it to someone unfamiliar with its full implications. Korath, son of Mora, captain of the Hovetal. He looked Alaric up and down with open assessment that was the Klingon equivalent of a formal greeting. And you are something I have not seen before. Alaric Stormfang, Wolf Lord, Space Wolves, 6th Legion. A pause. I am something most things have not seen before. Korath showed his teeth. On a Klingon, this was a smile. Your ship destroyed a Cardassian patrol vessel in 11 seconds. It was a mistake. I do not make the same mistake twice. No. Korath studied him. I don't imagine you do. He looked at the frost axe at Alaric's hip, at the wolf skull on his pauldron, and at the 10,000 years of campaigning written across the armor and the face above it. Something in his warrior's instinct was performing calculations that his rational mind hadn't quite caught up with yet. Worf, he said, acknowledging the lieutenant commander who had appeared at Alaric's shoulder. You have been spending time with this one. He is... Worf visibly selected his words with unusual care. Instructive. Korath looked at Worf. Worf's expression, normally a controlled landscape of professional severity, contained something that Korath, who had known him for years, identified with some surprise as genuine respect. Not the respect Worf gave Picard, which was institutional and earned through demonstrated wisdom. Something older. Something that operated below the level of rank and protocol. Walk with me, Korath said to Alaric, both of you. They found a briefing room and Korath listened. Truly listened, which was not always a given with Klingon captains who preferred speaking to receiving information. As Alaric described, in the economical language of a warrior briefing his peers, the nature of chaos corruption, the beacon, the timeline, and the entities that would follow if the rift opened. He asked 3 questions during the briefing. Each one was precise, tactical, and cut directly to the operational heart of the problem. At the end, he was quiet for a moment. Yes, in 10,000 years, he said, your people have not destroyed this enemy completely. No. And you keep fighting. Yes? Korath was quiet again. Then, in Klingon history, there is a concept. Heglumach kq jajvam. Today is a good day to die. It is not a death wish. He met Alaric's eyes. It is a commitment. To fight regardless of the outcome. To choose the battle even knowing it may never fully end. He paused. Your people understand this. Alaric looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind those pale eyes. Not warmth, but recognition. The specific recognition of a warrior who has spent his entire existence fighting a war that cannot be won and finds, unexpectedly, someone else who understands what that costs. We have a saga for it, Alaric said. Different words. Same truth. Korath nodded slowly. Then he stood, placed his fist against his chest in the Klingon salute. A gesture he did not give lightly. And both Worf and Alaric understood this, and said, the Hovital will fight beside you, not for the Federation, not for any alliance. His eyes were steady. Because this battle is worthy. Alaric returned the gesture with a fist against his own breastplate. A salute from a tradition 10,000 years older than the Klingon Empire, but carrying the same essential weight. Outside, in the darkness between stars, the corrupted vessel pulsed. The operative had no name on record. She operated under 17 different identities across 4 quadrants, and the one she was currently wearing, Lieutenant Sarah Voss, Stellar Cartography, USS Enterprise D, had been in place for 11 months before this moment made it worth the investment. Section 31 had known about the warp rift within 4 minutes of its formation. They had sensor arrays along the Cardassian border that Starfleet Command officially didn't know existed, feeding data to analysts who officially didn't exist, working for an organization that the Federation Charter officially didn't acknowledge. By the time the Enterprise dropped out of warp at the debris field, Section 31 had already filed 3 contingency assessments and opened a priority channel to their nearest field asset. Lieutenant Voss had received her instructions with the professional composure of someone who had long since made peace with the nature of her work. Obtain biological samples from the anomalous crew. Priority: tissue, blood, genetic material. Secondary: power armor component analysis. Do not compromise your cover. The subjects are to remain unaware. She had spent the subsequent hours moving through the Enterprise with the practiced invisibility of someone who understood that the best cover is not disguise but irrelevance. Be present in the right places at the right times. Be exactly as interesting as a stellar cartographer needs to be, which is not very interesting at all. She had positioned a modified medical tricorder behind a ventilation panel in cargo bay, one before the space wolves materialized. She had retrieved it afterward and transmitted the biological data through a subspace frequency that ran beneath the Enterprise's standard communication monitoring. The data she had sent had caused, she imagined, considerable excitement in certain undisclosed locations. What she had not anticipated was Brother Valdris. The rune priest had said nothing during the briefing room sessions that suggested he was aware of her. He had not looked at her directly. He had given no indication, in any behavioral sense, that her training covered, that she had registered as anything other than part of the ship's background. And yet, when she rounded a corner on Deck 7, carrying a data pad and wearing the expression of someone going somewhere unremarkable, he was standing in the corridor ahead of her, alone, waiting. He was still in full armor. He was always in full armor. His staff was in his right hand, the runic ironwork at its crown, catching the corridor, lighting and throwing patterns across the walls that seemed to move slightly more than the light source justified. His eyes, when they found hers, were doing that thing they did, seeing along a frequency she couldn't name. "Lieutenant Voss," he said quietly, "that is not your name." She stopped. 11 months of cover identity, 17 active personas, a decade of fieldwork, all of it compressed into the single second she spent deciding how to respond. She chose the truth, because Valdris had the quality of someone for whom lies didn't quite adhere. "No," she said, "it isn't. You took biological material from the cargo bay." "I did." Valdris studied her with those layered eyes for a long moment. "You serve an organization within your federation that operates without the knowledge of its leaders. That sees my brothers and me as assets to be acquired." It wasn't a question. "I have encountered similar organizations. The Inquisition performs analogous functions in my universe, gathering intelligence on threats, taking actions that the Imperium's official structures cannot or will not sanction." He paused. "I do not automatically condemn the impulse. I have seen what happens to civilizations that refuse to look at the darkness directly." She hadn't expected that. She had expected to be reported, possibly restrained. The Space Marines were large enough and equipped enough to do either without meaningful resistance from her. "Then why are you here? Why not go directly to Picard?" "Because," Valdris said, "I want to know what your organization intends to do with what you've taken." She considered her answer carefully. Section 31's operational security protocols were absolute. She had never broken them. She looked at Valdris, at the 10,000 years of institutional knowledge behind his eyes, at the staff with its runic wards that her tricorder had returned genuinely inexplicable readings on, and made a field assessment that her handlers would have found deeply uncomfortable. "Study it," she said. "Replicate it, if possible. The biological modifications your people carry, multiple organ redundancy, accelerated healing, enhanced musculoskeletal density. If those could be introduced into Federation physiology, even partially..." She stopped. "You would build soldiers," Valdris said. "Not with condemnation, with recognition." "We would build survivors," she said. "The Borg are still out there. The Dominion is consolidating in the Gamma Quadrant. The Federation's greatest vulnerability is that its people are fragile." She met his eyes. "You know I'm right." "I know that argument," Valdris said quietly. I have heard it for 10,000 years. It is the argument that built the first gene labs on Terra, in my universe, in an age before the Emperor unified humanity. It produced wonders." He paused. "It also produced horrors that took centuries to undo. The road from enhancement to atrocity is shorter than the people walking it ever believe." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere in the ship's infrastructure, a plasma conduit cycled through its pressure sequence, a sound like a slow exhale. What are you going to do?" she asked. Valdris reached into a compartment on his armor and produced a data chip, small, Federation standard format, which meant he had acquired it somewhere aboard the ship with a facility that suggested he was considerably more observant than anyone had given him credit for. He held it out to her. She took it. It was warm. That contains a partial record of the Adeptus Mechanicus's findings on Astartes physiology. The parts that are safe to share, the parts that will tell your organization why replication without the full process will produce something broken rather than something powerful. His eyes held hers steadily. I am not giving you a weapon. I am giving you a warning, dressed as information, so that your organization can make an informed choice rather than an ambitious one. She looked at the chip. Why? Because in my experience, Valdris said, the most dangerous thing in any civilization is not its enemies. It is its own people, moving in darkness, making decisions they believe are necessary, without anyone to tell them when they have gone too far. He stepped back, giving her the corridor. I will not tell Captain Picard what you are. That is your confession to make or withhold. But I will tell you this. The beacon will activate in less than 4 hours. Whatever your organization plans to do with what you've gathered, it will mean nothing if the rift opens. He turned to leave, then paused. Your Federation is worth protecting, Lieutenant. All of it, including the parts of it that don't know you exist. Remember that, when you report to your handlers. He walked away down the corridor, his armored footfalls resonating through the deck plating, his staff casting those subtly restless shadows, and she stood alone holding a warm data chip and the uncomfortable weight of having been seen completely by something that had no reason to be merciful and had chosen to be anyway. She tapped her concealed subspace transmitter. Control, she said quietly. I need to update my assessment. Stand down acquisition protocols. A pause. Because the asset just recruited us. In his office, 3 decks above, Picard was studying the Codex Maleficarium and feeling, for the first time in recent memory, genuinely afraid. The Borg cube dropped out of transwarp exactly where the corrupted vessel's beacon signal was strongest. It was not a large cube by collective standards, a scout configuration, approximately 3 kilometers per side, its surface a dark lattice of technological accretion that had been growing and adding to itself for longer than the Federation had existed. It had been tracking the anomalous subspace signal for 6 hours, its long-range sensors reaching across sectors with the patient. The omnivorous attention of a civilization that defined progress as the elimination of everything it hadn't yet consumed. The signal was extraordinary. The collective had processed it through 47,000 simultaneous analytical threads and arrived at conclusions that, had they been expressible in emotional terms, would have constituted excitement. The corrupted vessel's beacon operated on frequencies that intersected with subspace in ways the Borg had never encountered. The entities it was calling, whatever they were, represented biological and technological distinctiveness of an entirely unknown order. And then there were the other biosigns. The collective's initial scan of the Enterprise and the Fang of Morkai had taken 0.3 seconds. The Enterprise was familiar. Its crew cataloged, its technology assessed in previous encounters, its captain noted as a former drone whose neural interface had been more thoroughly purged than the Borg preferred, but whose residual connection occasionally provided interesting data. The Fang of Morkai was not familiar. The Borg processed its crew biosigns and experienced something that, in a civilization incapable of surprise, was the functional equivalent of it. The Space Wolves registered as human, or they also registered as something the collective's entire database had no precedent for. A biological optimization so comprehensive, so layered, so deeply integrated into every system of the body that the Borg's standard assimilation threat assessment returned a single unprecedented result. Distinctive. Acquire immediately. Priority maximum. The cube opened a channel on all frequencies. We are the Borg. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Our resistance is futile. Aboard the Enterprise, red alert klaxons filled every corridor with their urgent pulse. On the bridge, Picard stood at his command chair and felt the specific, cold weight that the Borg always produced in him. Something beneath rational threat assessment. Something that lived in the part of his nervous system that remembered being locutus, that remembered the hive, that remembered what it felt like to have 40 billion voices where his own had been. He pushed it down. He was practiced at that. Worf, evasive pattern Delta, full shields. He opened the ship-wide channel. All hands. Battle stations. In the tactical situation room, Alaric heard the Borg transmission through the Enterprise's internal communication system and felt something he rarely felt anymore. Genuine unfamiliarity with an enemy. He looked at Worf, who had remained at his side as tactical liaison with the focused professionalism of a Klingon who had temporarily subordinated personal feelings to operational necessity. The Borg, Worf said, a cybernetic collective consciousness. They assimilate other species, absorb their biology and technology into their hive mind. They adapt to weapons fire. They are... He paused with the particular difficulty of a proud warrior finding accurate words for something that genuinely frightened him. They are unlike any enemy I know. Alaric was already moving toward the door. They assimilate. They adapt. He processed this with the rapid tactical calculation of a commander who had fought things that fed on biology for 4 decades. Can they be killed individually? Yes. But the collective simply sends more. Then we do not fight them individually. Alaric's voice had shifted into the register it took on when he was purely operational. All philosophical complexity stripped away. The 10,000 years of accumulated doctrine rising to the surface like bedrock. We fight their ability to coordinate. We fight their signal. He tapped the communication panel on the wall. He had learned the Enterprise's basic systems with the rapid adaptability of a warrior who understood that knowing your environment was survival. Lord Stormfang to Captain Picard. Your Borg, their coordination depends on a signal between drones. Brother Valdris can disrupt psychic resonance fields. If your Borg collective operates on analogous principles, he may be able to create interference. Picard's voice came back immediately. Get him to the bridge, now. On the Fang of Morkai, Brother Gunner received Alaric's transmission and acted without waiting for elaboration. The strike cruiser's lance batteries were already cycling to full charge, its void shields extending to maximum coverage. Gunner had commanded the Fang in Alaric's absence through a dozen engagements and needed no instruction on what to do when a 3-kilometer enemy vessel appeared with hostile intent. The Fang of Morkai fired first. The lance strike hit the Borg cube's port, facing with an energy output that the Enterprise's tactical sensors registered with something approaching disbelief. Borg shielding technology was adaptive, regenerative, and had been calibrated against every weapon system in the Alpha and Delta quadrants. It had never been calibrated against a weapon that predated the Federation by 9,000 years, fired accelerated plasma at temperatures that shouldn't have been achievable without a star, and had been specifically engineered to destroy things that were very difficult to destroy. The cube's port shield matrix buckled. Did not fail. The Borg were too resilient for one strike to achieve that. But buckled, or visibly, in a way that the collective's internal damage assessment registered with the functional equivalent of alarm. Adapt, the collective instructed its drones. Recalibrate shielding to compensate for... The second lance strike hit before the adaptation completed. Valdris reached the bridge of the Enterprise moving at the controlled rapid pace of a space marine who was not running because space marines did not run toward threats. They walked with absolute certainty, all because running implied the possibility of arriving too late, and that was not a concept Valdris entertained. He took in the bridge in a single sweeping assessment, the view screen showing the cube, the Starfleet crew at their stations, the tactical displays, and went directly to an open space near the science console. I need to know the frequency of their coordination signal, he said to Data. Data's fingers moved across his console with inhuman speed. The Borg use a subspace frequency of 1.008 terahertz for collective communication, with a secondary encryption layer that modulates at... Show me the waveform. Data transferred it to the console Valdris was standing beside. The rune priest studied it for 4 seconds, his eyes moving across the waveform display with the quality of someone reading something in the numbers that the numbers themselves didn't know they were saying. Then he planted his staff against the bridge floor. He closed his eyes and began to work. What Valdris did was not, by any Federation scientific framework, possible. It was not telepathy in the sense that Betazoids practiced it. Not telekinesis in any form Starfleet's parapsychology division had catalogued, not any measurable psionic phenomenon in the Federation database. It existed in a space between what the Enterprise's sensors could detect and what they could explain. A manipulation of the boundary between physical reality and whatever lay beneath it. The same fundamental practice that the Adeptus Astartes called the warp and Federation science called subspace, and both civilizations had learned, through hard experience, to treat with extreme caution. The Borg cube's coordination signal developed interference. A not complete disruption. Valdris was working with the precision of a surgeon, not a hammer, pushing carefully against a system of extraordinary complexity. But the collective's 47,000 simultaneous analytical threads began returning corrupted data. Drones on the cube's exterior paused mid-task, their movements becoming fractionally uncertain. The hive's perfect choreography developing subtle hesitations like a clock with a grain of sand in its mechanism. Korath's voice came over the tactical channel from the Hovetler, which had decloaked off the cube's starboard side with characteristic Klingon timing. "Whatever your priest is doing, Stormfang, tell him to keep doing it. Their point defense systems just went partially blind." Picard looked at the view screen. At the cube. At the fractional hesitations in the Borg drone movement visible on the hull. At the Fang of Morkai charging its lances for a third strike. At Valdris, he standing absolutely still in the center of his bridge, his staff glowing with something that his ship's environmental systems were registering as a previously uncatalogued energy phenomenon. "Mr. Worf," he said quietly, "Pattern Theta. Target their power distribution nodes while their adaptation is compromised." Worf's expression, for just a moment, was the expression of a warrior in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. "With pleasure, Captain," the Enterprise fired. The Borg cube did not retreat. Retreat was not a concept the collective entertained with any more comfort than Valdris entertained arriving too late. It existed in the database as a tactical option, was assessed against probability matrices with the same dispassion applied to every other variable, and was rejected here because the biological distinctiveness of the Space Wolves had elevated this encounter to maximum acquisition priority. The collective had decided. The cube would adapt, compensate for Valdris's interference, recalibrate against the Fang of Morkai's lance weapons, and it would assimilate these extraordinary beings or it would not leave this system. It began sending drones. Not a boarding party in the conventional sense. The Borg didn't knock. 3 assimilation tubes punched through the Enterprise's shields at the precise frequency gap created by the transition between the primary and secondary shield grid. A vulnerability the collective had catalogued during Wolf 359 and never forgotten. And the drones came through in groups of 12, materializing in cargo bays, Jeffrey's tube access points, and Deck 14's secondary science lab with the methodical, unstoppable patience of a tide coming in. The Enterprise's security teams responded immediately and professionally, and were, against Borg drones, almost immediately insufficient. My phaser rifles on heavy stun settings cycled through their effectiveness within 40 seconds as the drones adapted, their personal shielding recalibrating to the weapon frequency with the collective's characteristic, maddening speed. 2 security officers went down under assimilation tubules before Worf's emergency containment protocols sealed 3 of the affected sections. Then Sven Ironteeth came off the Fang of Morkai via emergency transport, and the calculus changed. The Bloodclaw materialized in Cargo Bay 2, the largest concentration of drones, 11 of them, moving through the bay with the systematic efficiency of beings who had never encountered anything they couldn't eventually process, and stood for exactly 1 second assessing the situation. His chainsword came off his back in a movement that was less drawing a weapon and more the natural extension of a decision already made, or its adamantium teeth spinning up to operational speed with a sound like concentrated industrial fury. And he went into the drones the way a storm goes into a coastline. Borg drones were resilient. Their cybernetic plating was hardened against energy weapons, their frames reinforced against physical trauma, their systems redundant enough that damage, which would kill an organic being, left them functional. Against a chainsword wielded by a space marine at full physical capacity, a being with 4 times baseline human musculoskeletal density, Laraman cells closing wounds in seconds, a skeleton reinforced with ceramic ossified bone. They discovered the specific vulnerability of systems designed to absorb conventional force, encountering something fundamentally unconventional. The chainsword didn't care about shield frequencies. It cared about molecular cohesion, or which it addressed directly and without diplomatic preamble. Sven moved through 11 drones in 4 minutes. He was not unharmed. 2 assimilation tubules found gaps between armor plates, injecting nanoprobes that his enhanced immune system identified as foreign agents, and began systematically destroying with the same aggressive efficiency his body applied to every pathogen it had ever encountered. The Laraman's cells sealed the entry wounds. On the Susan membrane, the space marine organ that allowed voluntary control of unconsciousness, kept his nervous system from registering the tubule penetration as debilitating pain. He kept moving. On the bridge, Data was watching the nanoprobe interaction through the internal biosensor network with the focused intensity of an android whose processing speed allowed him to observe something extraordinary in real time. Captain, the Space Marine's immune system is destroying the assimilation nanoprobes. Complete rejection. The nanoprobes are being treated as foreign pathogens and neutralized. Assimilation is failing. Picard absorbed this. The Borg will adapt. Yes, but the adaptation window may be considerable. The nanoprobes have never encountered this specific biological architecture. The collective's database has no baseline to work from. Data paused. Captain, this is significant. If the Space Marines are genuinely resistant to assimilation, not now, Mr. Data. Picard knew what Data was building toward, knew it was important, filed it for later with the practiced efficiency of a commander who could not afford to think about implications while the immediate situation was still actively trying to kill everyone. What's the status of Valdris's interference pattern? Degrading. The collective is compensating, routing their coordination signal through backup frequencies. Our brother Valdris is tracking them, but it is requiring increasing effort. I estimate he can maintain effective disruption for another 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Picard looked at the view screen where the cube hung in space. Damaged but enormous. Its regenerative systems already beginning to seal the wounds the Fang of Morkai's lances had torn in its hull. The Hovedel was running attack patterns along its dorsal surface. Korath's gunners working the gaps in the point defense coverage with the precise opportunism of experienced Klingon warriors. It was coordinated, effective, and insufficient. The cube was simply too large and too resilient to be destroyed by 3 vessels, even 3 vessels of this quality. Alaric materialized on the bridge from the Fang of Morkai transport, having coordinated his own vessel's fire patterns remotely. Nyan stood for 3 seconds absorbing the tactical situation through the bridge's view screens with the rapid assessment of a commander who had been reading battles at a glance for 40 years. "We cannot destroy it," he said. It was not defeatism. It was diagnosis. "No," Picard agreed. "Then we prevent it from achieving its objective." Alaric moved to stand beside the tactical display. "It came from my brothers specifically, for our biology." He looked at Picard steadily. "Use that. Or draw its acquisition focus. Give it something to chase." Picard understood immediately and did not like it immediately. "You're suggesting we use your people as bait." "I'm suggesting we use my people as bait," Alaric confirmed, with the particular calm of a man who has volunteered himself for worse. "The Fang moves faster than your vessel and more erratically than your vessel. If the cube commits its transwarp pursuit to following us, it vacates the space around the corrupted vessel. You use that window." "To do what?" "To destroy the beacon before it completes activation." Alaric met his eyes. "We have," he looked at Data. 9 minutes and 40 seconds until full beacon activation, Data supplied. 9 minutes, Alaric said. "The Fang draws the cube. You take the Enterprise directly to the corrupted vessel and you destroy it before the rift opens. Whatever weapons you have, use all of them." Picard was quiet for 2 seconds. "And if the cube doesn't follow you? Know if it pursues the Enterprise instead?" "Then Valdris disrupts their coordination one final time. Everything he has, not a surgical interference but a complete psychic broadband assault. And you have 30 seconds of full drone confusion to get to the corrupted vessel and fire." Alaric held his gaze. "It will cost him considerably." "Define considerably." "He will recover," Alaric said. "Eventually." Picard looked at Valdris, who was still standing at the center of the bridge with his staff planted against the floor, his eyes closed, the energy around him having shifted from subtle to visible. a faint luminescence at the edges of the runic ironwork that the ship's sensors were registering as a previously uncatalogued phenomenon, and would continue registering as such because no existing Federation framework was going to resolve it into something explicable. Valdris opened his eyes. He had been listening, so it will cost me considerably, he confirmed. The corners of his mouth moved in something that was architecturally related to a smile. I have paid worse prices for lesser causes. On the view screen, the cube fired again, its adapted weapons finding a new frequency gap in the Enterprise's shields. And the ship shuddered under the impact, consoles flickering, the structural integrity field compensating with an alarm that indicated it was compensating at the edge of its design tolerance. Picard made his decision. Mr. Worf, open a channel to the Fang of Morkai and the Hovetal. He straightened. Wolf Lord, Captain Korath, here is what we're going to do. The Fang of Morkai ignited every thruster it possessed and ran. It was not a retreat. Every space wolf aboard understood the distinction with the bone-deep clarity of warriors raised on the saga tradition of Fenris, where tactical withdrawal in service of a larger hunt was as honorable as the kill itself. Brother Gunner pushed the strike cruiser to velocities that made the Enterprise's helm officer audibly recalibrate her understanding of what an ancient vessel was capable of. Its plasma drives burning at 114% rated capacity with the cheerful disregard for manufacturer specifications that characterized Fenrisian engineering philosophy, which held, broadly, that if something hadn't broken yet, it could give more. The Borg cube followed. Not immediately. The collective spent 1.7 seconds running probability assessments on whether this was a tactical feint. He concluded that the biological distinctiveness aboard the Fang represented an acquisition opportunity that superseded all other current objectives, and committed. Its transwarp conduit began forming off its port facing, the characteristic energy bloom spreading across local space like a bruise opening in reality. It's following, Worf reported, his voice carrying the controlled satisfaction of a plan working. The cube is transitioning to transwarp pursuit, or estimated time before it clears the area. 40 seconds. Helm, Picard said immediately. Maximum impulse. Get us to the corrupted vessel, now. The Enterprise moved with the urgent grace of a vessel being pushed by a crew that understood exactly what failure meant. On the view screen, the corrupted vessel was visible against the asteroid field's backdrop, a thing that had once been a spacecraft and was now something else. Its hull having spent enough time in chaos corruption that the boundary between the vessel and its contamination had become genuinely ambiguous. Bioluminescent growth covered its original hull plating in patterns that the Enterprise's sensors returned philosophical objections to quantifying. Its beacon pulsed with increasing urgency, the signal now strong enough that 3 crew members on Deck 9 were reporting auditory phenomena to Dr. Crusher's medical team. See, time to beacon activation? Picard said. 6 minutes, 14 seconds, Data replied. Time to weapons range? 90 seconds. Picard looked at Valdris. The Rune Priest had moved to the bridge's starboard side, planting himself with the careful deliberateness of someone conserving resources before a significant expenditure. The luminescence around his staff had faded. He had drawn back his interference pattern as the cube committed to pursuing the Fang, concentrating what remained of his psychic reserves for what came next. He looked, for the first time since materializing aboard the Enterprise, genuinely tired. Not diminished. Astartes did not diminish easily, but running on reserves rather than capacity, the way a reactor performs differently at 40% fuel than at full. He met Picard's eyes and nodded once. Ready. On the channel from the Hovetal, Korath's voice arrived with the clipped urgency of a Klingon captain managing a deteriorating tactical picture. Picard, the cube's transwarp conduit is forming faster than projected. It will clear the area in 20 seconds, not 40. You have less time than you think. Understood. Picard turned to Worf. As soon as we reach weapons range, full spread, quantum torpedoes, phaser arrays at maximum output, continuous fire. Target the beacon's power signature. Data. Can you isolate it? The beacon is drawing power from the vessel's warp core equivalent, a system I cannot fully map, but whose energy signature is concentrated in the vessel's forward section. Data's fingers moved. transferring targeting solution to tactical. Mr. Worf? Ready, Captain? 60 seconds to weapons range. The corrupted vessel's beacon pulsed again, stronger, and this time the effect on the bridge was physical, a pressure behind the eyes. A momentary auditory intrusion that wasn't quite a sound and wasn't quite a thought. Something that existed in the space between external stimulus and internal experience. Ensign Rowe at the con gripped her console. Lieutenant Commander Data tilted his head at an angle that suggested even his positronic brain had registered something anomalous. Picard felt it as a vibration in his back teeth and pushed through it with the focused will of a man who had faced the Borg Collective's total sensory override and come back from it. Valdris straightened. His eyes opened fully, and what was in them now was not tiredness but focus so complete it had passed through focus into something else. The absolute crystalline commitment of a warrior who has identified his target and removed everything else from consideration. He planted his staff. He began to gather. The Enterprise crossed into weapons range. Fire, Picard said. Worf fired with the comprehensive enthusiasm of a Klingon tactical officer who had been waiting for this moment through 7 sections of escalating frustration. The phaser arrays discharged in a continuous rolling pattern that tracked across the corrupted vessel's forward section with surgical precision, each beam arriving before the previous one's thermal bloom had cleared, while maintaining constant energy delivery on target. Quantum torpedoes followed in paired sequences, 12 in the first salvo, their detonations walking a line directly toward the beacon's power signature. Each explosion briefly illuminating the corrupted vessel's hull in clean photonic fire that made the bioluminescent growth recoil visibly, as though it recognized the light as hostile. The corrupted vessel fought back. Its weapons were not conventional. Where the Grumall had fired directed energy beams and the Fang of Morkai fired lances and mass accelerators, the corrupted vessel fired something that the Enterprise's tactical systems could only partially track. Projectiles that existed intermittently on sensors, present and then not present and then present again at a different position, as though they were having difficulty deciding which layer of reality they belonged to. R2 struck the Enterprise's shields and discharged energies that the shield grid processed with visible strain. The structural integrity field compensating with the urgency of a system being asked to handle something it was not designed to handle. Shields at 62%, Worf reported. Beacon power signature, reduced but not eliminated. The forward section is heavily damaged, but the beacon core appears to have secondary shielding I could not detect at range. Time to activation? 3 minutes, 40 seconds. Not enough. The math was clear and brutal. The Enterprise's weapons were doing damage, but not fast enough. And in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, the rift would open, and whatever lived beyond it would begin coming through, and no amount of phaser fire would be relevant after that. Picard looked at Valdris, but the Rune Priest looked back. He had heard the exchange. He had already done the same calculation and arrived at the same conclusion 20 seconds before Picard reached it. I need a direct line, Valdris said. Open space between us and the vessel. No interference from your shields on that bearing for 30 seconds. Picard understood what he was asking. Dropping the shields on any bearing meant absorbing whatever the corrupted vessel fired on that bearing with hull plating alone. Worf, can we rotate the shield geometry to maintain coverage on all other bearings while opening a firing lane? Worf worked his console with rapid intensity. Yes, but that bearing will be completely exposed. If the vessel targets it, it will, Picard said. He looked at Valdris again. 30 seconds. It will be enough, Valdris said. And then, quietly, with the specific weight of a warrior who means something precisely, it has to be. Mr. Worf, open the bearing. In now. The shield geometry shifted. A lane opened in the Enterprise's defensive field. A corridor of unprotected space pointing directly at the corrupted vessel's forward section like an accusation. The corrupted vessel's weapons immediately found it. 2 of those intermittent projectiles streaking through and detonating against the hull plating of Deck 11, with impacts that rang through the ship's superstructure like a struck bell. Damage reports cascading across Worf's console. A plasma conduit rupturing on Deck 12 with a contained explosion that the automated system sealed in 4 seconds. Valdris did not flinch. He raised his staff with both hands, the runic ironwork blazing now with light that cast no shadows, or rather cast shadows in the wrong directions. And as though the light was coming from somewhere that didn't share the bridge's spatial orientation. And he reached through the open bearing across 300 kilometers of vacuum and found the beacon's psychic resonance and hit it with everything he had left. The effect was not subtle. The corrupted vessel's forward section detonated in a cascade that began at the beacon's core and propagated outward through every system the corruption had touched. The psychic disruption triggering a catastrophic feedback through the beacon's power network that the vessel's structural integrity could not survive. It came apart in a sequence that was simultaneously an explosion and something harder to name. Sections of hull dissolving rather than fragmenting. The bioluminescent growth burning away in patterns that bore uncomfortable resemblance to screaming. Yet the beacon's final pulse releasing outward in an expanding wave that hit the Enterprise's exposed hull and passed through it like a cold wind through an open door. Every person on the bridge felt it. Every person on the ship felt it. It lasted 1.3 seconds and left behind it a silence so complete that the normal sounds of the Enterprise, the hum of systems, the recycled air, the subtle vibration of the warp core at standby, seemed to reassert themselves carefully, as though checking that they were still permitted. Valdris lowered his staff. He was on one knee before anyone realized he had gone down, his armor's servos compensating for the sudden weight redistribution, his breathing audible for the first time. He was conscious. His eyes were open. He looked at the view screen where the corrupted vessel was debris, and his expression was the expression of a man who has paid a price he agreed to pay and is simply acknowledging the transaction. Brother Valdris, Picard said quietly. I am functional, Valdris said. His voice had lost its resonance. Not gone, but diminished. Like a great bell struck too hard, still ringing, but differently. The beacon is destroyed. On the channel from the Fang of Morkai, Brother Gunner's voice arrived with the controlled urgency of someone managing multiple, simultaneous crises. My lord, the Borg cube has broken pursuit. It is reversing course. Worf looked up from his console. Confirmed. Yet the cube is withdrawing. He paused. Captain, the Borg are retreating. Picard looked at Valdris on one knee on his bridge. At the debris field on his view screen where the corrupted vessel had been. At the stars beyond it, undisturbed, the rift that had threatened to open now permanently foreclosed by the destruction of the beacon that would have torn it wide. Stand down, red alert, he said quietly. Begin damage assessment, and get Dr. the Crusher to the bridge. He crossed to Valdris and crouched to the Rune Priest's eye level, a gesture that, for Picard, was entirely natural, and that several members of his bridge crew would remember for a long time. Well done, he said simply. Valdris looked at him with eyes that were tired and clear and very old. The saga continues, Captain, he said. It always continues. The aftermath of battle had its own particular texture aboard a starship. It was not silence. A damaged vessel was never silent. Its repair crews moving through corridors with the purposeful urgency of people who understood that a starship's systems were not metaphors for survival, but the literal fact of it. Plasma conduits being rerouted, hull breach containment being verified, medical teams cycling through triage with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had done this before and would do it again. It was not chaos either. It was something between a controlled, focused busyness that carried underneath it the specific emotional weight of people who had been afraid and were now on the other side of the fear, processing what it had cost. Picard sat in his ready room with a cup of Earl Grey going cold on his desk and the Codex Maleficarium open before him, unreading by the starlight coming through his viewport, and thought about what came next. It was in many ways the most Star Trek question available to him. The immediate crisis was resolved. The beacon was destroyed. The Borg cube had withdrawn. And that withdrawal, Picard had spent considerable time analyzing, was itself significant. The collective had encountered something it could not immediately assimilate, something that disrupted its coordination at a fundamental level, i.e. something whose biology rejected its nanoprobes with a completeness that its adaptive systems had no baseline to address. The Borg had not been defeated. They were incapable of defeat in any permanent sense. But they had been discouraged, and a discouraged Borg cube that returned to the collective carried information that Picard did not yet know how to feel about. Because what the collective now knew was that the Space Wolves existed. He was still sitting with that thought when his door chimed. "Come," he said. Alaric Stormfang ducked through the doorway and stood in the ready room with the careful spatial awareness he had developed over several days aboard a vessel built for significantly smaller beings. He had removed his helmet and pauldrons, a concession to the ready room's ceiling that he had accepted with stoic pragmatism, and carried them under one arm. Without the full silhouette of his armor's upper configuration, he was almost comprehensible as a man. Almost. He looked at the cold tea, the open tome, and Picard's expression, and said, "You are thinking about the Borg." "I am thinking about what the Borg will do with what they learned today," Picard said. He gestured to the chair across his desk. Alaric sat in it with the care of someone who had learned through experience that Federation furniture was optimistic about the range of beings it needed to accommodate. The collective now knows your people are resistant to assimilation. They know Brother Valdris can disrupt their coordination signal. That information is already in their database, distributed across every drone in the collective. He paused. They will adapt. They always adapt. But the question is what they adapt toward. "In my experience," Alaric said, "so an enemy that cannot assimilate you directly begins looking for other methods of acquisition." He set his helmet on the desk with a sound like a geological event. "What will your Federation do?" Picard looked at him steadily. "That depends, in part, on what you decide to do." The Fang of Morkai was stationary 300 kilometers off the Enterprise's port side, its repair crews, space marines in full armor, working in vacuum with the casual disregard for inhospitable environments that characterize their kind, moving across its exterior hull, sealing the damage the Borg had managed to inflict during the pursuit. Brother Gunner had reported the strike cruiser operational within 6 hours. Valdris was in the Enterprise's sickbay where Dr. Crusher had spent 2 hours attempting to perform a medical assessment on a patient whose biology kept returning results that her equipment politely insisted were impossible, and had ultimately produced a treatment plan that Valdris described as adequate, and Dr. Crusher described as provisional, because neither of them had the vocabulary to fully bridge the gap between their respective medical frameworks. But both of them were professionals, and professionals find a way. Sven Ironteeth was also in sickbay, having finally permitted Dr. Crusher to examine the tubule entry wounds where the Borg nanoprobes had been destroyed. She had spent 40 minutes studying the nanoprobe remnants in his bloodstream. Inert, broken down, their complex molecular structures reduced to inorganic components by an immune response she had no medical precedent for. With the expression of a scientist standing at the edge of a discovery so significant, she was afraid to look directly at it. Alaric had found her there earlier. She had looked up from her scanner and said, with the directness of a doctor who had long since learned that beating around the bush wasted everyone's time, "Wolflord, I need you to understand something. Or what your people's immune systems did to those nanoprobes. The implications for anti-Borg medicine alone are—" "I know," Alaric had said, not unkindly. "I know what you are seeing. I know what you believe it could mean." He had looked at Sven, who was sitting on a bio-bed with the slightly impatient expression of a space marine who considered medical care a bureaucratic interruption to soldiering. "The apothecaries of my chapter have guarded the secrets of our physiology for 10,000 years. There are reasons for that, not all of them bureaucratic." Crusher had looked at him for a long moment. "Valdris already warned Section 31, she said. Alaric's eyes had sharpened. "Did he?" "Apparently. I'm told he gave them enough information to understand why attempting to replicate your biology without the full process would produce something broken." She had held his gaze. He trusted them with a warning. I'm asking you to trust me with something different. Not the secrets of your physiology, but your judgment about whether working together, carefully, with full transparency, could produce something that helps people without producing something that harms them." Alaric had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said, "That is a question I will need to think about." Now, in the ready room, Picard asked the larger version of the same question. "You cannot go home," he said. It was not cruelty. It was the careful establishment of fact as a foundation for everything that followed. Brother Valdris has assessed the rift mechanics. Without the corrupted vessel generating the warp signature that originally tore the opening, there is no pathway back to your universe. Not currently, possibly not ever. Alaric's jaw tightened fractionally. The glacier eyes moved to the viewport and the stars beyond it. He told me, "I'm sorry." "Do not be sorry," Alaric said quietly. We are space wolves. We go where the hunt takes us. We do not always choose our ground." He looked back at Picard. "But we choose what we do on whatever ground we find ourselves." "What will you do?" The Wolf Lord was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the starlight shifted fractionally as the Enterprise completed a minor navigational adjustment, the stars sliding across the viewport in slow procession. Outside, the Fang of Morkai hung in space with its wolf head prow facing outward, on facing the dark, the way it always had. "The chaos corruption that came through the rift with us," Alaric said finally. "The beacon is destroyed, but I do not believe we recovered all of it. Things that touch chaos leave traces, seeds." He looked at Picard. "Your universe is not equipped to recognize those seeds. Your science has no framework for them. Your diplomacy has no protocol for what they become." He paused. "We do." Picard understood. He had understood for some time. "Nick, you're proposing to stay." "I am proposing to do what space wolves do," Alaric said. "Hunt what needs hunting. Protect what can be protected. Learn, as we go, what this universe requires of us, and what it can offer in return." Something moved in his expression that was architecturally distant from warmth, but occupied the same general territory. "Your Federation has principles I do not always agree with. Your prime directive seems, to me, like a philosophy designed by people who have never watched a civilization die because no one intervened. Your faith in diplomacy strikes me as occasionally optimistic to the point of danger." He met Picard's eyes. "And yet, you came to a debris field with no weapons showing and offered honest conversation to something that had just destroyed a vessel in 11 seconds. That is either extraordinary courage or extraordinary foolishness." "In my experience," Picard said, the distance between those two things is smaller than most people suppose." Alaric looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a man performing an action that carries weight he wants properly acknowledged, he reached out and placed his fist on Picard's desk. Not a strike, a placement. The Fenrisian gesture of formal commitment, of a warrior declaring that he stands on this ground and means it. "Then we will be fools together, Captain," he said, "for as long as this universe requires it." Picard looked at the fist on his desk, at the frost axe at Alaric's hip, at the Codex Maleficarium lying open between them, 10,000 years of hard-won knowledge about a darkness this universe had not yet learned to see. He placed his own hand beside Alaric's fist. Not matching the gesture, he had his own, but answering it. "Welcome to the Federation's neighborhood, Wolf Lord," he said. "I suspect you'll find it adequately challenging." Outside, the Fang of Morkai turned its wolf-head prow toward the stars, and somewhere in the Alpha Quadrant's depths, in places no sensor had yet mapped, the first seeds of chaos corruption lay dormant in the dark, patient as only things without mortality can be patient, waiting for a civilization that didn't know they existed to look the wrong way at the wrong moment. They would not find that civilization unguarded. In the weeks that followed, the Fang of Morkai became the most anomalous entry in Starfleet's vessel registry. A strike cruiser from another universe, crewed by warriors who had never heard of the Prime Directive and were not entirely persuaded by it, operating on the edges of Federation space with a provisional charter that Admiral Nechayev described as unprecedented and Picard described as necessary. Valdris recovered his full capacity slowly, and spent his convalescence engaged in long conversations with Data that both of them found, in their respective ways, deeply illuminating. Sven Ironteeth earned a commendation from Worf that he received with the polite bafflement of a man who had never previously been given a certificate for anything. Brother Gunnar kept the Fang operational through methods that caused O'Brien physical pain to observe. And Alaric Stormfang stood watch at the edge of a universe that had not asked for him, that did not entirely understand him, and that needed him more than it knew. The Borg had their Data, Section 31 had their warning. The seeds of chaos lay waiting in the dark. And between all of it stood a wolf lord from a dead reality. Frost axe at his hip, glacier eyes scanning the horizon, doing what space wolves had done for 10,000 years. Holding the line. Live long and prosper. More stories await.